I was coming around the side of the barn with 2 buckets of feed and a headache I'd been carrying since before sunrise. The morning was cold the way October mornings get out here. That flat, bone-deep cold that settles into the fields before the sun is even fully awake. My boots were already muddy. My shoulders already ached. That was normal. That was every single morning of my life on that land. What wasn't normal was stopping dead in my tracks 15 feet from the paddock gate because of a sound. Not a bad sound, not an alarm, just a laugh. Her laugh. Ruth's laugh. I'd heard it before. Dozens of times, probably. She'd been my neighbor for almost 3 years by then, and in a place this isolated, neighbors become something closer than neighbors pretty fast. But this laugh, it was different. Lower, softer, like something she'd kept folded up inside herself for a long time and had only just let out into the open air. I looked without meaning to. She was standing near the fence post at the far end of her property, the one closest to mine, where the old cedar leans in from the wind. She was holding her own coffee mug, chipped blue one she always carried, and she was laughing at something her sister-in-law had said. Vera was visiting for the week. Vera was standing close to her. Too close, maybe. Close enough that their arms were touching through their winter layers. And Ruth had her face tilted up toward the pale sky with that laugh coming out of her like she'd finally stopped holding her breath. I stood there, frozen. Buckets still in both hands, and something happened in my chest that I cannot explain. I turned around and walked back the way I came. I didn't go back around that side of the barn for the rest of the day, and I spent the entire drive into town that afternoon trying to convince myself that what I felt when I saw that laugh had nothing to do with me. It had everything to do with me. I just didn't know it yet. Let me tell you about Ruth the way I knew her then, before all of this. She moved to the property next to mine in the spring of my 34th year. I'd been farming that land alone for 18 months by that point. Not farming it successfully, I should say, but farming it with a stubbornness that probably looked like confidence from the outside. 42 acres of dry grass, a herd of 12 cattle that had opinions about everything, 2 broken fences I kept patching, and a farmhouse that needed work I kept postponing. She moved in with someone. That was the first thing I noticed about her, that she arrived with a life already built. A truck full of furniture, a dog named Biscuit, who immediately got into my vegetable garden and did significant damage, and a woman named Carol, who drove a newer truck and clearly knew how to back it into tight spaces, which I found irritating and impressive in equal measure. Carol was her partner. Had been, I was told later by Jolene at the feed store, for almost 9 years. I noticed Ruth the way you notice anyone who arrives in a place this empty. She was tall, the kind of tall that seems to know where it's going. Dark brown hair cut practical and short. Hands like she'd been using them her whole life. She introduced herself by walking straight across the property line between our places and holding out her hand, like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Ruth Calloway," she said. "I already owe you for the garden. My dog has no respect for boundaries." I liked her immediately. I didn't think much about that. Out here, liking someone immediately is just survival. We became the kind of neighbors that frontier isolation creates. Not friends exactly at first, more like colleagues in the shared project of not letting the land beat us. She'd knock on my door when her tractor wouldn't start. I'd show up at her fence when a section of my irrigation pipe needed a second pair of hands. We'd stand in each other's kitchens in muddy boots drinking coffee while the morning decided what it was going to be. I learned her in pieces the way you learn anyone who works beside you. She was careful. Not shy, careful. There's a difference. She watched things before she spoke about them. She'd stand at the fence line looking at her own pasture the way a person looks at a math problem they almost understand, like she was waiting for the land itself to tell her what it needed. She was funny in a way that arrived slowly, a dry sentence after a long pause, a look that meant something. You had to be paying attention, and I always was, though I never asked myself why. She was good at carrying things. Not just physically, though she was that too, but emotionally. Things that would have made me spiral, she just held. A hard season, a sick animal, a piece of equipment that failed at the worst possible moment. She'd say, "Well, that's the land," and mean it as a full philosophy. Carol visited on weekends mostly. I gathered she worked in the city, a 4-hour drive east. I gathered their arrangement was newer than it looked. The long distance, the visits, the way Ruth never quite talked about her the way you talk about someone you're building a daily life with. I didn't analyze it. It wasn't my business. What was my business was that Ruth became the person I called when I didn't know who else to call. When the heifer got stuck in the creek, and I needed someone at 11 at night. When I got a letter from the county about a property dispute and didn't understand what it meant. When the power went out for 3 days in January, and I knocked on her door with my frozen pipes and nowhere else to go. We spent those 3 days together, mostly around her wood stove, with biscuits sprawled between us and the radio playing something old and staticky from a station we could barely get. We talked more in those 3 days than I'd talked to another person in months. She told me about growing up in eastern Montana, sisters everywhere, a grandmother who grew the best squash in the county and never let anyone forget it. I told her about the years before the farm, the apartment in Denver, the job I'd had that paid well and felt like nothing, the morning I drove past a for sale sign on 42 acres of Kansas prairie, and did something I still couldn't entirely explain to people. She laughed when I told her that part. Not at me, just at the recognizable logic of it. "Same," she said, and left it at that. I went home when the power came back on. I stood in my own kitchen, which suddenly felt enormous and too quiet, and made myself a cup of tea, and thought about nothing in particular. Or told myself I wasn't thinking about anything in particular. It happened so slowly that I didn't clock it as happening. That's the thing no one tells you about the kind of feeling I'm talking about. It doesn't arrive like weather you can see coming from across the plain. It arrives like a change in the light. You look up one day and realize it's different, and you can't point to the exact hour when it shifted. The first thing I noticed was that I started finding reasons to be outside when I knew she'd be working near our shared fence line. I told myself I was checking the cattle. I told myself I needed to look at the irrigation. Both things were often technically true, which made the lie I was telling myself easier to believe. But I knew the pasture rotation. I knew roughly where she'd be on any given morning, because we'd fallen into a rhythm of similar schedules. Coffee at 6, animals by 6:30, fence check by 8. And I started arranging myself inside that rhythm more deliberately than I had before. When she waved from across the fence, I felt something settle in my chest. Something that shouldn't have been a relief but was. I told myself, "She's your neighbor. Of course you want to see her. It's isolated out here. That's normal." Then there was the sound of her truck coming up the road. I don't know when I started recognizing the specific engine sound of her truck. I don't know when that became distinct from any other sound on that road. But there was a week in September when I realized I was listening for it. Not consciously. The conscious version of me was doing dishes, or feeding the dogs, or reading something I'd already read twice. But some lower level of me was tracking the road. And when I heard that engine, something in my body responded before my mind got there. I didn't examine that. Carol came for a long visit in September. 2 full weeks. I saw Ruth less. Ruth's patterns changed. She was staying closer to her own house, doing things in the evening she'd usually do in the mornings, clearly reorganizing her day around someone else's presence. I noticed this with a specificity that embarrassed me when I finally admitted it. I found myself at Jolene's feed store one afternoon with no particular reason to be there, other than that I needed to be somewhere that wasn't my own land for a while. Jolene was one of those women who knew everything about everyone in a 40-mile radius, and had the discretion to use that knowledge kindly. "Ruth's got her partner visiting," she said, not looking up from the order she was filing. "I know," I said. Jolene looked up then, just for a second. just enough to make me look at something on the shelf. Good for her, I said, which was true. It was true. But I drove home with my hands tight on the steering wheel and a feeling in my stomach that I could not name. And I went to bed early, and I lay there in the dark with my eyes open listening to the sound of absolutely nothing, and told myself I was tired. The thing about Vera was that she arrived in October and she was Ruth's sister-in-law, Carol's sister, which should have made everything simpler. She was visiting because she'd had a rough year, some trouble I didn't ask about and wasn't told directly. She was staying in the spare room of Ruth's farmhouse for an indefinite stretch. And she was, from the first day I met her, exactly the kind of woman that everyone likes immediately. Warm, easy with herself. The kind of person who asks your name and actually uses it. I watched Ruth with her. I shouldn't say that. Let me rephrase it as the truth. I noticed Ruth with her. I noticed because they were easy together in a way that Ruth and I were easy together. That particular ease of two people who don't have to perform for each other. Except with Vera, it had a different quality. More relaxed, maybe. More playful. Ruth laughed more. Ruth stood differently, less like she was holding herself against something and more like she'd set the weight down. I told myself I was happy for her, which I was. I also told myself that the sourness I felt watching them was something other than what it was, which it wasn't. The morning I came around the barn with the feed buckets and stopped at the sound of that laugh, Ruth's real laugh, the one from somewhere deep in her, wasn't the beginning. It was just the first time I couldn't pretend anymore that I hadn't noticed. I want to tell you about a Tuesday in early November. It was the first hard freeze of the season. The kind that locks the ground solid overnight and makes every task on the property take twice as long because nothing moves the way it's supposed to. I'd been up since 4:30 dealing with a water line that had given out, and by 7, I was cold in a way that coffee wasn't touching. Ruth showed up at my door at 8 with a casserole dish wrapped in a dish towel and a look that said she'd heard the truck running in the dark and knew what it meant. "Eat," she said. Just that. I let her in. We stood in my kitchen. She wouldn't sit. She had animals to get back to. And she watched me eat a bowl of whatever was in that dish while she refilled her coffee from my pot like she'd done it 100 times. Which she had, probably. And then she said quietly, not looking at me, "You okay?" Not about the water line. The way she said it made that clear. I looked up. She was looking at me with something in her expression that I didn't know what to do with. Not pity. Not even concern exactly. Something more like recognition. Like she'd been watching me for weeks and had finally decided to ask out loud what she'd been asking silently. "I'm fine," I said. She nodded once. Picked up her hat from the counter. Didn't say anything else. And she left, and I stood there with the empty bowl and the sound of her truck starting in my driveway. And I felt the absence of her more acutely than I had ever felt the absence of another person. That scared me enough to do something stupid. I started being busy. I filled every hour with something. Fence repairs I'd been putting off, paperwork I'd been ignoring, phone calls I made to people I hadn't spoken to in months. If Ruth knocked on my door, I answered it, because refusing to answer would have been obvious, and I was not going to be obvious. But I stopped finding reasons to be near the fence line. I stopped showing up at 8 for the particular quiet we'd built between ourselves in the mornings. Ruth noticed. Of course she did. She didn't say anything for 2 weeks. Then one afternoon she came to help me with a section of fencing that I genuinely needed help with. I'd asked, because I couldn't not ask without being unreasonable about it. And we worked for 3 hours in almost total silence, handing tools back and forth, moving along the fence line in our usual efficient way. When we were done, she said, without looking at me, "Did I do something?" The question hit me in a way I wasn't prepared for. "No," I said, immediately. "True." "Okay," she said. And I wanted to say more, and I didn't, because what would I have said? that the problem wasn't what she'd done, but what I'd felt watching her laugh. That I'd been managing something for months without a name for it, and had recently run out of the energy to manage it. That I didn't know what any of it meant, or what I was supposed to do with it. I said nothing. She went home. I watched her cross the property line from my side. That night, I sat on the porch in the cold until I couldn't feel my hands, and I looked at the dark horizon, and I thought, "What are you doing?" No answer came. There were the small things, too. The ones that accumulated. The morning she came by to drop off seeds she'd gotten extra of, and when she handed me the paper bag, our fingers touched and I pulled back faster than the situation required. She looked at her own hand afterward, just for a second. Not confused, just registering something. The evening she called to ask me a question about the county water table, and I sat on the phone with her for 40 minutes talking about nothing related to the water table and hung up feeling better and worse simultaneously. The afternoon I drove past her property and saw her standing at the fence line looking across the plain with her hand resting on the cedar post. And something about the stillness of her in that moment, the way she looked like she was listening for something the land wasn't quite saying, made me pull over on the road and sit there for longer than I'd like to admit. There was Vera. I should be honest about Vera. Vera was easy to dislike and impossible to actually dislike. She was helping Ruth in real ways, physically, practically, with tasks that two people do more efficiently than one. She'd had a hard year, and she was healing in the only way that makes sense, by working. And she was doing it alongside Ruth, with a warmth and ease that was entirely real. There was nothing wrong about it. There was nothing even complicated about it. Except that I watched how Ruth looked at her when Vera said something that made her laugh. That specific look, fond, open, the guard all the way down. And I thought, that's what I want from her. That exact thing. And then I thought, she's not yours to want anything from. And then I sat with that for a while. The night I finally stopped pretending to myself was a Friday. Not dramatic. Just a Friday night in late November with the wind coming hard from the north and the sky turning the color of a bruise. I was sitting at my kitchen table trying to read something I couldn't focus on. And I thought about Ruth. And then I didn't try to stop thinking about her. And then I let the thought go all the way to the end. All the way to what I actually wanted. What I had actually, for months, been wanting. I sat with it until it stopped feeling like a shock and started feeling like a fact. And then I washed my dishes, went to bed, and stared at the ceiling for a long time. The land outside made its usual sounds. The cattle moved somewhere in the dark. The wind pressed against the windows. I thought, okay. So now what? But before we continue, if you made it this far, you already know this feeling. That thing that grows in the quiet, in the daily proximity, in all the small moments that shouldn't mean as much as they do. So go ahead and hit that like button right now. It takes 2 seconds and it helps me keep bringing stories like this one straight to you. And if you're not subscribed yet, subscribe now and turn on the notification bell. That way YouTube lets you know the moment a new story lands on this channel. Now tell me in the comments, have you ever stayed silent about a feeling because the timing was impossible? Because the person was already somewhere else? Already someone else's? Tell me what that cost you. Type it for me. I read every single one. And tell me which city you're watching from. I'll heart every response. Now, back to our story. December came in like it meant it. 3 days before Christmas, a storm hit the valley that the Weather Service had underpredicted by a significant margin. By midnight, it was a full whiteout, the kind where you lose the boundary between where the land ends and where the sky begins. 2 of my cattle got out through a fence section the wind took down, and I found out at 1 a.m, when the oldest one, a stubborn red heifer I'd had for 6 years and could not afford to lose, started bellowing from somewhere in the dark I couldn't locate. I was already in my boots and coat and out the door when my phone lit up. Ruth's number. "I can see them from my porch," she said. "South fence. I've got the light." That was it. No preamble. Just the information. I waded out into that storm toward her light. She was already at the fence line with a lantern and a lead rope, Biscuit sensibly refusing to come outside and watching from the window. We worked in the dark and the snow for over an hour, getting both cattle back through a gap in the fence we patched with wire and stubbornness. By the time we got back to her porch, we were soaked through our coats, and the temperature was still dropping. "Inside," she said. Not a suggestion. I followed her in. Her house smelled like wood smoke, and something baking she must have started before the storm hit. Vera was asleep. I could see her bedroom door closed at the end of the hall. Ruth moved around the kitchen in that quiet, deliberate way of hers, getting towels, getting me something hot to drink, not making it a production. I sat at her kitchen table and dripped onto her floor and watched her. She put a mug in front of me and sat down across the table, and that's when I noticed she was looking at me differently. Not the recognizing look from November. Something else. Something she hadn't quite put away as carefully as she thought she had. "You're going to get yourself killed out there alone one of these winters," she said. The tone was light, but the underneath of it wasn't. "Same goes for you," I said. She looked down at her mug, and there was a silence between us that was not like our usual silences. Our usual silences were easy. The silences of two people who'd run out of words and were comfortable with that. This one had something in it, something waiting. I heard Vera shift in her room. A floorboard. Ruth's eyes went to the hallway for just a moment, and I saw something pass across her face that I hadn't seen before. Or maybe had seen and hadn't let myself read. A kind of weight. A kind of something that doesn't fit in the life I'm currently living. I thought about the 9 years Carol and she had been together. I thought about the long weekends, the visits that ended with a truck pulling back out of the driveway. I thought about Vera, sleeping 20 feet away, who was Carol's sister and Ruth's house guest, and who had been watching Ruth too, in that particular careful way people watch someone they care about more than they're saying. And I thought about myself, sitting here at this table, dripping on her floor. Not her neighbor. Not even just her friend anymore. Something that had been growing for almost a year in the specific soil of a place where there's nowhere to hide and nowhere to go, and the days are too long and too honest. "Ruth," I said. She looked up. And the thing I'd been managing, the thing I'd been carrying in my hands for months, like something fragile, like something I didn't know how to set down without breaking, I just let it be visible. For the first time. Not in words. Just in the way I looked at her. She went very still. The storm pressed against the windows. The wood stove ticked. I said, "I think I've been making everything more complicated than it needs to be." She looked at me for a long moment, and then she said, very quietly, "I think you've probably been making it exactly as complicated as it actually is." I didn't know what to say to that. "Vera," she said, just the name, like it explained something. "I know," I said. Because I did. "Carol." "I know," I said again, and I meant it with everything in me. She nodded once. A short nod, something private resolving in her face. "Okay," she said. We sat with that for a while. The storm going on outside, the mug warm in my hands, her face across the table, open in a way it wasn't usually, like the storm had taken something down in her the same way it had taken down my fence. I didn't go home until the storm let up enough to walk safely across the field. She watched me from the porch with the lantern. I didn't look back until I was at my door, and when I did, she was still there. I raised my hand. She raised hers. And I went inside, and stood in my own dark kitchen, and felt, for the first time in months, like I was standing on ground that was real beneath my feet. Not resolved, not finished, not even remotely simple, but real. What happened next took 3 weeks. You'd think 3 weeks was a short time. In that winter, on those 2 pieces of land, with the temperature refusing to come above 20 most days, and the world contracted down to what was immediately in front of you, 3 weeks was its own whole season. Vera left first, not because of anything dramatic. She left the way people leave when they've healed enough to go back, quietly, practically, with her truck packed in the morning and a hug for Ruth that lasted longer than a hug usually lasts. I saw it from across the property line without meaning to. I saw Ruth stand at the end of the driveway and watch the truck until it was gone. I didn't go over that day. I let her have it. 2 days later, Carol called. I know this only because Ruth told me about it afterward, and even then she told me in pieces, over days, the way you tell someone something you're still fidgeting the shape of. What she told me was, Carol had known. Not specifically, not with names. But Carol had known the way people who've loved someone for 9 years know things. In the quality of phone calls, in the way Ruth talked about the land now versus how she'd talked about it before, in the difference between a person building a life and a person who's already built one but isn't sure it's the right one anymore. What she told me was, Carol had been the one to say it first. That was the part that surprised me, that it wasn't Ruth who broke the thing they'd built. It was Carol who recognized it was already breaking, who cared enough to look at it honestly instead of waiting for it to collapse the way old structures do when nobody tends them. She said she'd rather lose me with honesty than keep me with avoidance, Ruth told me. We were walking the fence line when she said it. January now, the sky pale and cold and the grass white with frost. I could see my breath. I could see hers. That took courage, I said. It took more than I have, she said. And she wasn't talking about Carol anymore. I stopped walking. She stopped too. This is the thing about the inversion, and I understand it now in a way I couldn't have at the beginning. When I met Ruth, I thought she was the one who was settled, the one who already knew. 9 years, a partner, a life with structure, and I was the one who was loose, unmoored, still assembling something she couldn't name. But that's not what was true. What was true was that I had spent a year learning what I wanted by watching her. And in watching her, I had, without knowing it, become entirely sure of myself in a way I'd never been before. The farm that I'd been failing at slowly, stubbornly, I wasn't failing at it anymore. The life I'd driven toward on impulse, past a for sale sign on the Kansas plain. It had become an actual life. My life. And I'd done that. Ruth, meanwhile, Ruth had been so careful, so contained, so good at carrying things, that she'd carried the wrong thing for years without letting herself look directly at it. The strength I'd admired in her was real, but some of it had been used to hold a shape that didn't quite fit. She'd thought she was the stable one. She'd thought I was the one still figuring it out. And here we were. Her figure on the fence line, frost on the dead grass, and the wide cold sky above us that didn't care what we decided. I don't know how to do this, she said. And the way she said it was so different from every other time I'd heard her handle something hard. Quiet, direct, already past it. This was slower. This was real. Neither do I said. That's not very reassuring. No, I agreed. She looked at me. That open look. The guard down. I've been watching you, she said. This whole year. I told myself I was just paying attention to a neighbor. Someone alone on a piece of difficult land. And I knew it wasn't that. Somewhere around February, I knew it wasn't that. And I kept it very far away from myself because I couldn't look at it directly. I thought about February, the power outage, the 3 days around the wood stove, the talking. I know, I said. You always knew before I did, she said. There was no accusation in it, just observation. "I think I just had less to lose by knowing," I said. "You had a whole life built." "I thought I did," she said. The wind moved across the field between us and the horizon. She reached out and touched the fence post between us. That old cedar post, where I had watched her stand, months ago, looking at something the land wasn't saying. "I don't know what I'm doing," she said again. And I said, "You're standing here. That's something." She looked at her hand on the post, then up at me. And the thing I saw in her face was not the careful steadiness I'd been watching for a year. It was something younger, something that had been kept back for a long time, and was finally, cautiously, being let forward. I didn't move toward her. I didn't reach across the fence line. I just stayed where I was, in my muddy boots and my winter coat, with the cold pressing against every exposed inch of skin, and I let her look at me for as long as she needed. She exhaled, a long breath, visible in the cold air, like she'd been holding it. "Okay," she said. Quiet. Not to me exactly. To herself. And then she lifted her chin and looked straight at me and said, "Come over for dinner tonight." Not a question. Not elaborate. Just that. "Okay," I said. And I went home to feed my animals, and I stood at the kitchen window with the afternoon light turning everything the color of old copper. And I noticed something. I wasn't afraid. I'd spent a year being afraid of this. Afraid of the wanting, afraid of the name for it, afraid of what came next. And now it was here. Concrete and real, and still entirely uncertain. And I was not afraid. I was, for the first time in as long as I could remember, just present. The land outside did its ordinary things. The heifer moved near the fence. The dry grass bent in the wind. The sky went on, enormous and indifferent and beautiful. And I thought, the one who looked more vulnerable was me. The one who looked more stable was her. But the one who found her footing first was me. And the one who finally let herself be uncertain enough to be honest, that was her. We hadn't saved each other. We'd just been standing close enough to the fence line that when the ground shifted under both of us, we reached for the same cedar post. I don't know what we are yet. I won't pretend I do. What I know is this. I drove 42 acres of empty land past a sign on a road in Kansas because something in me was listening for something I couldn't name. And I've been here ever since, in the cold and the mud and the difficult, honest life of it. And I am more myself here than I have ever been anywhere. And the person across the fence line, the one who made coffee in the dark and showed up in storms and watched me for a year from the careful distance of her own settled life, she's figuring out who she is too. For the first time, maybe. Without the shape she'd been carrying. 2 women on 2 pieces of land, in the middle of a plain that doesn't ask you anything. Just shows you who you are when you stop being afraid of the answer. The one who looked strong surprised herself by falling. The one who looked uncertain surprised herself by landing. If this story stayed with you, if you recognize something in the fence line, the storm, the year of small moments that added up to something impossible to ignore, type Frontier in the comments. That's how I know you were here with me until the end. And if you want to keep following stories that go where feelings actually live, click the video appearing on your screen right now. Take care of yourselves out there. Until the next story.